It's a great. So yeah,
So you're
in my career.
she's doing a lot of work for.
Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. I like take other stuff, but I'm not gonna like encounter again. Because I don't know the news.
Yeah, it's funny. Get that.
Are you in the area?
I see what you said. So I'm sure there.
You know, New Jersey, I've been here. I've been here now.
Yeah.
And then they're like, oh, what? Yes. Yeah, it's right. Oh, I should.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the afternoon breakout. This is track 3, carbon management, carbon accounting. If you're on the wrong flight, now is your chance to get off. This morning, when I was giving thank yous, I forgot to thank my colleague Adam Mazrowski, who's been incredibly helpful. So I want to give him a shout out. He's also been responsible for the weather today. So I'm Ethan Shankman, partner at Arnold & Porter. I'm on the ELI board, and I'm also an adjunct professor of environmental law here at Georgetown. So that's my third hat. I am known to cold call, and there will be a quiz. So welcome to track 3. As was to take a big step back and to echo some of what Professor Jenkins had to say, I think one piece of common ground this conference is that we all acknowledge that the IRA is potentially the most impactful climate legislation ever enacted. But the reason for this conference is that it only addresses 2 legs of a 3-legged stool. The IRA addresses technology and innovation. It addresses economics, significantly lowering the cost of these technologies and innovation. What it doesn't address at all are the new legal and policy frameworks that must be developed if the energy transition is to become a reality, and what that transition will look like on the ground. For this reason, for example, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, in its recently released report on accelerating decarbonization in the US, said that there's a need to focus specifically on gaps in the current policy portfolio and barriers to implementation that would prevent the nation from attaining its climate, economic, and humanistic goals. Significant gaps and barriers are to be expected, the report states, because nothing of this scale and with this diversity of goals has ever been attempted. I think that is an accurate statement of the case and why we're having this conference. So what are we going to talk about today in the 2 panels? First, panel 1, the role of carbon capture and direct air capture, divergent stakeholder views, and the need for new legal and policy frameworks. To define our terms for a second. Carbon capture and storage refers to the separation and capture of carbon dioxide at the point source of the emissions from industrial processes or power plants prior to release into the atmosphere, and the permanent storage of the CO2 in deep underground geologic formations. So there's three really important pieces to CCS. There's the capture at the source. There's then the compression and injection into pipelines, where the CO2 is then transported to storage locations, and that's where injection occurs, the third piece of the puzzle. Hundreds of meters underground, well below groundwater tables, beneath a layer of cap rock at a pressure which causes the CO2 to become immobilized permanently so that it will not escape into the atmosphere. And that third piece, the injection piece, requires a permit from EPA. It's called a Class 6 permit. It's issued under the Underground Injection Control Program, part of the Safe Drinking Water Act. In the words of the Department of Energy, carbon management approaches such as carbon capture are essential climate tools for meeting 1.5 degrees Celsius targets. When deployed responsibly, these approaches are complementary, a whole solution, and not a replacement for parallel efforts to reduce emissions through the deployment of energy efficiency, renewables, nuclear power, and clean hydrogen. So why talk about CCS? Why is it an important enough topic to have a track or a panel devoted to it? So I would say there's 5 reasons. I'm going to talk about them briefly right now. One, it's a significant part of the IRA, and it's happening now. The number of projects in the pipeline has just exploded recently. I'll talk about that in a second. Second, because study after study from the International Energy Agency, from the IPCC, from the US Department of Energy, from Princeton, shows that climate goals cannot be fully achieved without all the tools in the toolbox, including carbon management technologies like carbon capture. 3, because we have to acknowledge there are deeply divided views about these technologies, not just carbon capture, other technologies that are incentivized by the IRA. And I'm going to talk about that because we have to acknowledge it, and we have to talk about how those concerns are to be addressed. 4th, because EPA's effort to regulate CO2 emissions from power plants under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act relies on carbon capture and sequestration and hydrogen as the best systems of emission reduction. And so if EPA is going to achieve its goal of reducing greenhouse gases from the power sector, it's critical that that technology be supported and approved by the courts. And 5th, it's a nascent technology. The injection part has been around for decades, but injecting purely for the purpose of sequestering carbon dioxide to address climate change is new, and a lot of these new use cases are new. And because of that, there is not a single overarching regulatory regime that covers carbon capture. And in fact, a lot of the legal and policy framework is being addressed on a patchwork basis on a state-by-state level. And so there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of discussion to be had in terms of what those policy and legal frameworks should say. So first of all, again, it's a significant part of both the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law, and it's happening. And with permission from my friend from the Clean Air Task Force, this is a map showing the proliferation of projects that are being, at least in the planning or proposal stages throughout the United States for a lot of different use cases: biofuel cement, direct air capture, we'll talk about heat and power, hydrogen, etc. As little as 18 months ago, there were only about a dozen Class 6 permit applications pending before EPA, just 18 months ago. And now there are about 57 projects, the total of 167 permit applications pending before EPA. So this is happening, and we need to talk about it. Second, study after study shows that climate goals cannot be fully achieved without carbon management technologies as one tool in the toolbox. Picking up on some of the things that Professor Jenkins talked about this morning, one piece of the puzzle. The International Energy Agency's net zero roadmap was released just last month. And it says that CCUS, hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels, and sustainable bioenergy are critical to achieve net zero emissions. That rapid progress is needed by 2030, and that together CCS, hydrogen, and hydrogen-based fuels account for 1/5 of emissions reductions in their net zero scenario in the 2030 to 2050 period. But we are nowhere near, in terms of deployment, the amount of CCS that IPCC, IEA, Princeton, et cetera, that their models show are going to be needed to play an important part of the solution, a piece of the puzzle. This shows that there's in 2022, well less than 100 million tons of carbon CO2 storage capacity. According to the IEA net zero scenario, which is the most ambitious scenario, there needs to be 1 gigaton of capture capacity by 2030, 2.4 gigatons by 2035, and 6 gigatons by 2050. So if this technology is going to play a role, there's a lot of development and policy work that needs to be done. It's also, CCS is also critical for US net zero plans, according to the US Department of Energy, particularly in the industrial sector, for difficult to decarbonize heavy industries like chemicals, refining, iron and steel, cement. So this is from the Department of Energy Industrial Decarbonization Roadmap, and it identifies 4 pillars to get the United States where it needs to be in the industrial sector by 2050. Energy efficiency, industrial electrification, other alternative energy technologies, and CCUS. But third, as I said before, there are deeply divided views about this technology, and we have to acknowledge that, we have to recognize it, we have to talk about it. So a number of environmental justice and energy justice organizations have raised deeply held and strongly voiced concerns about aspects of recent decarbonization policies and their impacts on the environment and on disadvantaged communities, including CCS. For example, in a letter to Secretary Granholm, the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum, a national coalition of environmental justice leadership, argued that technologies like CCS should not be classified as clean if they increase pollution burden, expand fossil fuel reliance or infrastructure, or exacerbate health risks. Now, the Biden administration has been responding to these concerns. CEQ put out a guidance on development of CCS that focuses on environmental justice, that calls for enhanced benefits to reduce or mitigate harms, to equitably serve affected communities, and it talks about the need for transparency. I think that's a really critical concept, transparency about the benefits, harms, and trade-offs during project planning, development, siting, permitting, especially when impacting disadvantaged communities. As just one other example, the Department of Energy recently put out for comment a responsible carbon management initiative. Comment period closed recently, so hopefully that will come out in final form, and it encourages project developers to proactively pursue the highest levels of safety, environmental stewardship, accountability, community engagement, and societal benefits in carbon management projects. Is this the right response? Is it a sufficient response? Hopefully, those are some of the issues that will be discussed on the panel. It is important to point out before I move on that concerns are not limited to environmental justice groups. There have also been a lot of concerns raised by private property rights organizations, landowners, particularly in rural areas, and so it is deeper and wider than just environmental justice groups. As I said, fourth reason why we need to talk about this is that EPA's power plants rule relies on CCS and hydrogen as the best systems of emission reduction. And EPA had to find that those technologies were both cost effective and adequately demonstrated. That's something that's going to be tested in the courts. If the courts wind up setting aside them, it's not clear what that means for EPA, because the Supreme Court has instructed EPA that it can only apply technologies at the site within the fence line. And this is what EPA has identified as the best technologies to do that. And finally, as we might talk about further on the panel, a lot of the policy development here is taking place at the state by state level. There's now 15 states with significant legislation addressing CCS, addressing property rights, forest-based ownership, long-term state stewardship, taking over primacy for the permitting program, et cetera. This is a state by state tracker that we maintain at the Sabin Center at Columbia. But that's something that hopefully we'll talk about on panels. So now I want to turn to the topic of the second panel, and starting with an issue. The second panel is measurement, reporting, and verification, offset markets, and net zero accounting. And I want to start by talking a little bit about carbon removal, because it's a good segue between the two panels. It's relevant to both the first panel and the second panel. So CCS is about decarbonization. It's a mitigation. It's about avoiding emissions, preventing them from going into the atmosphere. But CO2, as we know, lasts in the atmosphere for a very long time. And there's a history of legacy emissions. How do we reverse the trend of putting carbon in the atmosphere? How do we take the carbon that we've already in the atmosphere and remove it in a sustainable way? Why is that important? Why is carbon removal an important issue? Again, because study after study shows that even if the IRA works as fully envisioned, even if GHG emissions are reduced as much as possible, we're still going to need massive amounts of carbon removal to deal with CO2 already in the atmosphere. It's the net in the net zero. There's always going to be hard to abate emissions that are not going to get to are not themselves going to get to zero. And there's also the possibility, a lot of the modeling shows this, that even if we get to net zero by a certain time frame, there's a very strong possibility of an overshoot during the interim. And that, the amount of legacy emissions that are generated during that overshoot needs to be addressed. According to the National Academy of Sciences, most global net zero scenarios assume negative emissions equal to 10 to 20% of today's emissions by the year in which net zero is achieved. And you can see the role that carbon dioxide removal and negative emissions technologies play in the gray lines beneath the zero bar on this graph, which is the long-term strategy of the United States pathways to net zero by 2050. So there are a suite of removal solutions that are being explored. They all have their own pros and cons, costs and benefits. There's forestry, both afforestation and reforestation. There's soil carbon sinks. There's ocean carbon sinks. And there's direct air capture, which is where you bury the emissions, you inject them underground to permanently sequester them, but the emissions, rather than being drawn from a point source, are drawn directly out of the atmosphere. There are a lot of issues that these technologies raise. There's the environmental and social costs. There's land use, water use, energy use. Are these solutions that are consistent with environmental and climate justice? How much is needed? Who pays? How do we promote research and development, innovation, and incentivize carbon removals in a sufficient way? What is the role of government? These are some of the questions that I think our panelists will address today. And finally, in the second panel, there's also going to be significant discussion about voluntary carbon markets. How to set the rules for to ensure that voluntary carbon markets have integrity. So that when when a company is making a claim about having reduced greenhouse gas emissions or permanently remove them, legacy emissions from the atmosphere, that's additional, verifiable, reliable, enforceable, etc. And needless to say, voluntary carbon offset markets have faced intense scrutiny recently. A lot of concerns have been raised about integrity, including but not limited to double counting, transparency, verification, issues pertaining to market structure, as well as the need for responsible, legible communication. There's no one single entity that oversees the market for carbon offsets. Voluntary carbon offsets are managed by a patchwork of nonprofit organizations that run various registries. Some have advocated that the US federal government become involved in establishing standards for these carbon credit markets. And there are a whole host of new initiatives from organizations like the Integrity Council on the Voluntary Carbon Market, and the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, where there's a lot of talk about moving from VCM 1.0 to VCM 2.0. What does that look like? How is it going to work? How will it serve the interests both of addressing climate change, reducing legacy emissions, and addressing all of the societal values that are embedded in the IRA and that we talked a lot about this morning. So that's my effort to sort of lay a foundation, set the table. We're now going to hear from 2 consecutive panels. The first one's going to focus mostly on CCS and a little bit on direct air capture. And the second one is going to focus more on the voluntary credit markets, but also carbon removal technologies. So with that, I'd like to invite the panelists for the first panel to come up on the stage, which will be moderated by Judy Harvey, who is an assistant chief in the law and policy section in the environment division at the U.S. Department of Justice. So Judy, thank you.
Thank you.
And please come on.
All right, well, thank you so much, Ethan, for that introduction. And I used to work with Ethan, so I'm excited to be here and talk to you all. I do feel a little bit like I'm back in law school, so that's some PTSD. But otherwise, I will manage this. But I am excited to introduce our panelists today. We'll start with some brief introductions, and I will kind of kick it off to them to give some opening framing remarks. Then we'll get into a discussion, and at the end, hopefully Adam will help remind me. 10 minutes will at the end will allow for questions from you all, because you all are coming here with lots to add to the discussion too, and want to make sure we have a chance to do that. So as Ethan said, this panel is called The Role of Carbon Capture and Direct Air Capture, Divergent Stakeholder Views and the Need for New Legal and Policy Frameworks. So as Ethan said, I'm at DOJ, but just putting it out there, I do not express any views of the Department of Justice or the federal government. But personally and professionally, I've been an environmental lawyer my whole career, and really am interested in issues involving new technologies and how to incorporate those and learn from them at both the federal level, but then also, as I think we'll get into here, a lot of the activity around CCS is going on at the state level. And so how do those systems mesh, and how do you then also accommodate very local concerns? We'll both talk about kind of the divergent stakeholder views as Ethan mentioned, and also kind of think about what, in light of that, how to accommodate that into these frameworks. So with that, I will do quick introductions. So Mehran Tesfaye is a senior policy analyst with the Bipartisan Policy Center's Energy Program. And she has worked on clean air, clean energy, and sustainability issues, and specifically on designing policy interventions that can help with the impacts of climate change. And then we have Melissa Carey. And so Melissa is the head of climate, ESG policy, and government affairs at Folsom, working on decarbonization efforts. Prior to that, worked at a number of NGOs and brings that perspective as well. We also have Simone Stewart, who, like Mehran, has an engineering background. So I'm also very excited to hear the technical aspects of things. So She works as an industrial policy specialist for the National Wildlife Federation's Climate and Energy Policy team. Ben Longstrip is at the Clean Air Task Force as the Global Director of Carbon Capture. And prior to that was at NRDC and worked on legal and technical analysis related to climate standards. With that, we're going to kick off with like just a framing question, and I'll let each panelist give about a 3 to 4 minute overview. But basically, I'm interested in hearing from you all how CCS and direct air capture fits in with the U.S. response to climate change and to facilitating an equitable energy transition from the perspective of each of your organizations. So, Meira, why don't you kick us off?
I was gonna be second.
Oh, sorry.
It's all good. Hi, everybody. Really good to be here. I'm with the Bipartisan Policy Center, and just to kind of frame how we think about this issue, I mean, most of it even kind of describe the need for CCS and the need for carbon removal solutions. But obviously, we need those technologies, but how we do it also matters. And we at the Bipartisan Policy Center have also looked at how just broadly clean energy infrastructure is deployed, and we realize and we understand there is historical inequities there that need to be resolved. We also have seen from case studies and examples that even at the demonstration scale, engaging and getting buy-in from communities is very essential. And then, you know, through partners that we work with on permitting and siting issues, we realize that developers are facing huge trust challenges, and that's in part because of historical actions, you know, whether that is federally or local activities, but there's just it's creating communities that preemptively kind of say no, not just to CCS, but all clean energy projects. So that means it's all hands on deck, and really the solution is to really get that build that trust in all aspects of clean energy, including CCS and carbon management solutions. And that's kind of how we think about it, and how we see this issue sort of cross different party lines.
Thanks, Meira. Melissa, why don't you give your opening remarks?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Carey. I am still newish to Wholesome US. I am the head of climate, ESG policy, and government affairs. And I started my role at Wholesome in January of this year, so coming up on 1 year after the almost 25 years in government and NGO advocacy around climate issues. So really pleased to have made the jump from policy advocacy to a little bit more of the doing of the things that we have been advocating for I don't know, a couple decades now. So Wholesome, for those of you that are not familiar with the company, is the world's largest producer of cement, concrete, and related building materials. We are actually not describing ourselves any longer as a cement company. We are, if you ask our global CEO, Jan Janisch, he will describe us as a global sustainable building solutions provider. That is a very intentional shift of mission for the company, which reflects not only the net zero commitment that we made, the SBTI verified commitment, but also the competitive decision that the company made 5 or 6 years ago to embrace decarbonization and to be the first in our sector to achieve net zero emissions. For Wholesome US, that means net zero emissions, not offsets, direct emissions. I'll get into our scope 1, 2, 3 a little bit, but we have made a commitment to go big on decarbonizing our cement operations. That is by far the biggest chunk of our emissions profile. It's 75% of our scope 1 emissions are direct from our cement production. CCS is obviously the big piece of that. We'll obviously talk more about that today. We're also moving our vehicle fleet, including our big quarry trucks, over to electric vehicles. We are on track to have 100% renewable electricity generation by 2030. And we are all in on the low embodied carbon product standards and procurement initiatives that have been advanced through GSA and other agencies. I'm excited to talk more about our work today. I'm very enthusiastic about it, but I'll stop there and turn it over to you, Simone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Judy. As she said earlier, my name is Simone H. Stewart, and I'm the Industrial Policy Specialist with the National Wildlife Federation. So I'm housed within our national federation here in DC, and I work on our climate and energy policy team. So I'm not sure how many people in the room are familiar with the National Wildlife Federation. Maybe you donate, maybe your children read Ranger Rick magazine. But a lot of people, it's not apparent why a wildlife organization would be at this intersection around climate and technologies. And so oftentimes when I'm invited to be in the room to talk about CCS, there's kind of a side look like, oh no, is she here to protest? So I just want to clarify a little bit about the organization. So we are a federation, so we have 52 chapters across the US and its territories. And those chapters have their own individual autonomy. They set up their own kind of state-based goals. And so for us about a decade ago, we really started having a conversation with our federation that was a little bit more rooted in climate, because for a long time, the organization had been doing work that was really conservation-based work, talking about conserving wetlands in particular areas, or, like don't get our science team started on birds because they're all ornithologists. So, it was very kind of like 101 conservation ecology. And so we started having a conversation internally in the organization at the national level saying, well, we can't really talk about doing good conservation without talking about climate at the same time. And so there was, a risk to doing this because a lot of the states are, basing their practices off the political skew of their state. So we were a little bit nervous to talk about climate, but it's been a really successful endeavor as far as the federation. And so a few years ago when I was brought on board, it was because there was this conversation within the larger climate community, but within our organization, saying, how are we as an organization that is focused on wildlife, that is focused on protecting wild places, going to reconcile with this big need for infrastructure, this big build-out need? So our federation figured that it was better to have somebody that worked on the inside, that understood these things, to help navigate the organization through this really difficult transition, hence my role. And as Judy said, I have a background in engineering like Metro, and I have a PhD, so I also feel some of that trauma being back on a university campus, Judy. So I really have foundations in the science behind things. I'm a mechanical engineer. My PhD was around the fluid mechanics of direct air capture. And so making a big transition into the policy space to kind of shape the democratic participation, because that's one of the ways NWF really thinks about doing things, because we have chapters in a federation. So, everything at NWF, for better or for worse, is a democratic process. And so really it was about how you can change public opinions to get people who are, really focused on wildlife conservation to think largely about big issues around clean energy and necessary infrastructure. I think that they did a market survey a couple of years ago that the average donor to NWF was like a 52-year-old named Stacy who loves butterfly gardens. And, so it's like, how do I get a 52-year-old named Stacy to think about CCS? And so that's been a big part of what we do at the Federation, is public education and trying to bring our larger wildlife constituency into this recognition that to preserve wild places, to have wild places and protect wildlife, we have to do something about the climate. And that means sometimes deploying solutions that are technological. Our constituency constituency is a really big fan of natural climate solutions, obviously. So trying to kind of start with a step of, well, you recognize how trees work, so think about like a technical photosynthetic process, and that's what DAC is. And so how do we explain these kind of things in a public way and advocating for these communities and wildlife communities at the federal level? So we do all of it. I would like to believe that we have a very nuanced perspective as a wildlife organization around what is needed and what is necessary. And as Meron said, you know, how we take the pathway to achieving that.
Excellent. Thanks so much. That was great. I hope I can be as engaging. I'm with the Cleaner Task Force. I focus on carbon capture. Cleaner Task Force is focused on climate change and embraces a broad set of technologies from renewables, geothermal, advanced nuclear, carbon capture, and I get the carbon capture part. I'm thinking about where this, and I should say I'm a lawyer, so I also feel that, but I enjoyed law school. And it is shocking, but I also, now that I'm trying to do this work, I envy the engineers. Okay, so I start with the kind of question of, you know, how enormous is the climate challenge, and then, you know, CCS is part of that solution. Just you can look at, Jesse showed some you know, downward trends within the US recently, and those are great. The slope is not what it needs to be. But if you look globally, each year we continue to emit more CO2 than we did past years. So we really haven't even globally turned the corner. And obviously there are lots of areas that enjoy far fewer energy resources than we do. So the scale is enormous. We need to be moving so quickly to drive down toward net zero. My view is that our response has to be to take the actions that will maximize our chances of success in that. And that means deploying as many solutions as we can that can help us solve the problem. And carbon capture is one. This is, and just sort of to reiterate some of the points Ethan made earlier, the analyses from the IPCC have said this for many years. Just this past April, IEA looked at kind of what are the credible pathways, what are the key things we have to do to stay on track for 1.5 degrees, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And their conclusion was that carbon capture was one of 4 critical items that we had to advance quickly in the 2020s if we're going to do that. I think, to me, the other reason for the broad portfolio is just that we don't know what roadblocks we're going to encounter on any of the options. Jesse Jenkins, if you were here earlier, talked about the amount of transmission we need if the full renewable path is the one we're going to take. I'm all for all of that transmission. We have people at CATF who are working on those issues, but we shouldn't bet the planet on being able to do any one of these things. Likewise, with just citing renewables, probably Simone's members don't always like a lot of renewables. On the landscape, it's the solar and wind path is much more land intensive than other options. So that's why I think we need all the be moving fast on lots of options, you know, advanced nuclear also. We also need it to be an equitable transition. I think carbon capture can help us with that as well. I think we heard this morning also that different communities have hold different values. And that means in some cases, there may be an industrial facility, a power plant, a cement plant maybe, that is an anchor of that community, provides a lot of jobs, and the community will want that facility to remain. Maybe not everybody in the community, but maybe a majority. Carbon capture can help us cut the carbon pollution without forcing the people who work there to get new jobs and retrain themselves. For other communities, there may be very significant conventional pollutant issues, hazardous pollutant issues that are of great concern. I think in these cases, carbon capture actually can also help reduce those pollutants from the facilities. Clean Air Task Force has been working on a analysis. It's overdue. I was hoping it would be out already. It will be out soon, I promise. Where we just looked at 4 plants in detail, 2 of them cement plants, 2 of them fluidized catalytic crackers, and had an engineering firm design the carbon capture system that would be applied to them. And one of the key factors is that to have the carbon capture work, to get the CO2 molecule, you have to make sure that your flue stream is clean enough of things like SO2, sulfur dioxide, that the SO2 will not gunk up and degrade your ability to catch the CO2. So in order to do the CCS, you actually also have to clean up your flue stream of conventional pollutants. So what we found in this sneak preview you're getting was a 98% reduction of the SO2 at these facilities and a similar reduction of the particulate matter, both very important public health harming pollutants. You know, depending where the facilities are, how many people live there, you have different kind of, that equates to different numbers of lives saved. Also depending on how many pollution controls the facility already has, in other words, how much SOx it's emitting already, you get a different outcome. But for those 2, and I'm not going to say that this is true for every plant or anything, but for those 2, if we put a capture unit on, we should end up with some very strong co-pollutant and public health benefits. So all of it needs more analysis and study, but it's something that we hope we can work with communities on. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, you already preempted one of my questions, but it was very helpful because I was going to ask, you talked about some of the opportunities that CCS could provide, and I'm hoping maybe some of the other panelists would like to expand on that, and what they see as sort of a potential opportunity that the technology and implementation at a potentially larger scale could bring.
So I'll jump on that. So one of the things I've learned in my months so far at Wholesome is how incredibly long-lived our facilities are. And I know this is the thing that you hear about industrial facilities, right? They don't turn over much. Well, so Devil's Slide, Utah, one of our Western plants, has been in operation for 106 years. When you were talking about an anchor for a community, that's an anchor for that community. It's pretty sparsely populated. It is east of Salt Lake. It's beautiful and remote. And that facility has been providing solid jobs to that area for a very, very long time. So at the moment, we're looking at a material substitution process for Devil's Slide that would lead to a significant CO2 reduction by reducing the amount of clinker. It's the really CO2 heavy part of concrete. It would substitute a naturally occurring material for part of that clinker, come out with the same solid product at the end with a big CO2 reduction. In order to do this at Devil's Slide, we'd have to put in a new mill and do some substantial upgrades at the plant. But we've been there over 100 years and we continue to plan to operate there. And making these long-term investments in that facility is part of the plan, right? To keep those jobs in place, to keep the supply in place for that part of the country, and so on. So yes, I agree. We also operate St. Genevieve. That's the world's largest cement kiln. It's in St. Genevieve, Missouri. That is our top priority for carbon capture. And again, that facility is also relatively new, it's only 10 years old. And the idea is to keep it in place for a very, very long time, and that means getting rid of the carbon.
Thanks, Naira or Simone.
Yeah, I think Melissa's example is like a perfect one because the industrial sector is, you know, it's the major kind of sector that's gonna benefit from carbon capture and storage, with purification, with efficiency improvements, we can get maybe 30 to 50% reduction, and this is from an analysis from DOE. But for the rest of the way, we're gonna need different alternatives like hydrogen, carbon capture, and storage. And then when you sort of zoom in into different sectors, for example, you know, fuel production, you still need drop-in fuels. Fuel production has a very high concentration of CO2. It's a fermentation process, it's not a combustion process. So it can actually easily be retrofitted with CCS to capture CO2, and that can also provide dividends to, you know, local communities, with storage facilities, etc. So there's different kind of nuances within each sector that can benefit from.
Yeah, I think pretty much everyone up here covered it. I think that there are obviously opportunities in the industrial sector, and something that I tell people frequently is that I think a lot of people in the general public don't realize how much we rely on the industrial sector for every piece of our kind of livelihood and the things that make our lives convenient. And so there is some kind of, you know, we do need to think about consumerism and behavior and can we ramp things down, but I think, you know, one of the industries that will benefit really a lot from CCS, I think, is the chemical industry. And it's something that a lot of us, I think, don't consider how much, you know, chemical plastic that we consume and how high emitting those processes are. And so I think that the other aspect of it is that CCS is going to be a necessary part of these industrial decarbonization strategies that will also allow us to transition the economy in a lot of other ways. And so a lot of times people will say, well, I don't really like CCS, I would rather have renewables. And it's kind of like, well, where do you think those renewables come from? That wind turbines are made of steel and cement. And we just had the gentleman from Ørsted earlier talking about the monopile of a turbine. So, you know, those are all kind of industrial characteristics. It's an industrialized process to build these massive offshore turbines. NWF recently took a trip to Rhode Island, and we got to see the offshore turbines off Block Island. And it was amazing how massive they were. And it was like, truly, this is an industrialized process, even to bring us the really great aspects that that I think the general public might have a better, more comfortable understanding of, like renewable energy. It's the same thing for transmission. You know, Ben was absolutely right. We have a transmission specialist that also works on our team. And if you talk to people in the Midwest, it's like, you know, when you talk about transmission, you talk about renewable energy, you suddenly are in a conversation about like the lesser prairie chicken and like what's going on with all the species that are endangered, and like don't get our folks from Wyoming started on the build out of renewable. And so I think that one of the things that we've learned from having these difficult conversations that are difficult but necessary is that none of these solutions are impact free. And I think that it's really about having conversations to decide what the impact is, who is experiencing it, how it's being distributed, and those are the questions that I think that the general public really wants answers to. And so I think that the more that we, you know, dive deeper into CCS and how it can help these industries that impact people in these communities and all of our daily lives, I think the better understanding that people will have of it, and the more opportunities that we'll have around communicating why this is important and why something like the IRA is worth it.
Great, thank you. Well, now that we've talked about some of the opportunities, I'm very interested in hearing, you know, we've even alluded to some of these, but what challenges do you all see? That could be political challenges, technological challenges, economic challenges, and so we can start to unpack what you think of as those challenges, and then we can move on to any ideas you have on addressing them. So anybody want to talk about some challenges with implementation? Well, I'll go first. Jeez.
I was just thinking, which category should I start?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we could talk, why don't we focus first on technological, and then maybe people can talk about that, and then maybe we can address the political or policy side. But are there technological challenges that you all see, particularly in getting something, to scale?
I mean, I'm happy to start I certainly see them. I think wherever industry has needed to do carbon capture, where you had to pull the CO2 molecule away from other molecules, we have done that. We've done it for many years. So we know how to do that. Ethan also noted we have put in many millions of tons of CO2 underground. We know how to do that, but we haven't applied it to many different facilities. So we haven't put it on a cement plant. We haven't put it on other plants. And there also are there's an energy penalty to carbon capture. It's not energy free. But if you're using the amine solvent, and I'm counting it on the engineers to correct me, take over, it binds with the CO2, and then you generally have to heat it in order to get the CO2 to be released. So that's an energy use. And we're constantly trying to improve the system to make it more efficient, which means we need to introduce new technologies, the new vendors who have new ideas. Some have totally different ideas. They want to chill it all down and sort of have it snow CO2 in their system, and it would be even better. The co-benefits would even be greater. We'd get all the NOx also, but they need to scale up, and that's a big challenge. So I think figuring out how you scale up, identifying that there's this big first of a kind risk. So we need to de-risk the technology so that when Wholesome goes to a bank, the bank says, "Oh, great, we've seen this before. You can have a lot of money." But also, I feel like we want this. I want to make sure that these other technologies that are not as far along also get a chance. And this is the moment when DOE has a bunch of demonstration dollars. I wish we had a longer string of those for newer versions. But anyway,
I would just add on to that I think Ben is exactly right. I think for me, when I have conversations with people, I think a lot about the struggles of the deployment of just infrastructure writ large. And so a lot of people say, well, the technology is nascent and we don't understand it. And like Ben said, that's not really true. People have been doing CCS from an engineering perspective, people have been doing CCS for a long time. We understand the science behind it. It really is about the deployment of all of the pieces of the puzzle fitting together correctly. And I was talking to a journalist and he was like, well, that's a technology issue. And I was like, I don't think it really is though, because other countries have done it. And a lot of times people don't like using outside examples, but CCS has been successful on a global scale, that other countries have used it, that Norway has been sequestering CO2, in the ocean from natural gas since 1999. And people generally aren't aware of that. Japan is also a really big into CCS, and they have a lot of CCS in development and a lot of kind of build up towards that development. They were also sequestering underground offshore in Japan, and it was really successful. So I think we have lessons learned from these other kind of global examples, but the other thing that those countries have in common when you think about Japan and Norway is they are incredibly good at deploying infrastructure. So it's I think that Jesse brought up a great point earlier in his presentation that the mass of what we need to do as far as infrastructure is on the scale of the New Deal. And the US hasn't done something like that in a long time. So I think it really is exactly that commercial scale up in engineering. You talk about the valley of death, that is a critical point when you're trying to go from lab bench or small pilot all the way up to deploying this nationwide, but it has been done in other places. And so I would like to believe that it really is that the US kind of has to figure out what the best strategy for that is going to be for us as a country.
I'd like to echo that. Can we talk about that?
Thank you.
So enabling conditions, right? So there are the engineering challenges. How do you bolt on the technology that we have to the facilities that need the technology? And yes, a steel mill is not the same as a cement kiln, right? So you need different approaches. And we like the approach of making it snow CO2. That's a cool thing. But it actually takes a lot of water, which is another challenge that we're, right? So there are engineering challenges that go along with applying the technology to any particular application. And also, you're totally right? We haven't done something infrastructure wise on this scale in practically any of our lifetimes. So I like to use this example. No one's yelled at me for using this yet, so I'm just gonna use it one more time. We have a facility in Ravenna, New York, upstate New York. It's the only supplier of cement, cementitious materials to New York. Obviously, concrete, I don't know if you know this, but it's the most transacted substance in the world after water.
Yes.
So New York City, you can imagine that market is huge. There's one production facility left in New York State, that's ours. And so it's a vital resource for the region. We would love to capture carbon at Ravenna, and we have looked at it extensively. We even considered it and to put forward for DOE decarbonization money. Let me just tell you 3 of the hurdles that we had to manage for number 1, no pipeline infrastructure and massive opposition in the state to anything that rhymes with pipeline. No pipelines. If you say pipeline, people freak out. So heavy opposition. Also along with that, no place to put, if you could get a pipeline, no place to put the carbon, right? No wells anywhere nearby. And third, we thought of another application. Maybe if we were funded for the hydrogen hub, the Northeast Hydrogen Hub, we could use green hydrogen and don't ask me, ask an engineer. There's a magic you can work to create sustainable aviation fuel using hydrogen and captured carbon. And there's a big market for that in LaGuardia, JFK. Maybe that could work. And our European folks had a really good question, which is SAF still going to be an acceptable fuel use by the time a project like this got done? Because the EU was looking at taking that off the table. And we're a Swiss-based company, so we pay attention to the EU. So that was another question, right? So I won't get into the DOE timetable for submitting all this information, which is another challenge, but I think, you know, this is a big undertaking, right? It involves public opinion, it involves engineering, it involves siting, it involves a time element. And I think, you know, the other thing that's really, really important here is that we don't have all the time in the world to figure it out. And I'm just gonna put my advocate hat back on just for a second and say that when people use the words emergency and crisis, we agree. And so we can't just figure it out as people are comfortable or, you know, as things evolve, as they do. You know, we have a 2050 commitment as a company, but Ben, I think you pointed out the global trends are not on our side. And so we feel this tremendous sense of urgency to move this stuff along, even though, you know, society, engineers, scientists, land managers, you know, the authorizers of permits, you know, we all have to kind of rise to the occasion as well.
And I don't want to kind of continue on this challenge. There does seem to be quite a lot of technical challenges, and you've talked about kind of you raised the challenges to infrastructure that you're getting, that stakeholders and folks on the ground are raising. And so I'm wondering if we could, and I promise we'll get back to more optimistic stuff later, but like let's talk about the stakeholder views and kind of how the political challenges are kind of manifesting themselves and what you all are seeing. So Mayrona and I were talking about this before the panel. So maybe if you wanted to start us off, that would be great.
Maybe someone else can start. I'm trying.
You're gelling, yes.
I'm trying to put my thoughts together.
Yeah. So anybody else wanna kick that off in terms of talking about some of the other views on the ground and maybe the diversity of different kinds of views?
Right. Yeah, so being a federation, we see a broad spectrum of kind of the different views that are held that depend on kind of the history and the politics within the state. And so, I'll use two examples that we started to do carbon management engagements. We do industrial CCS work, and then we also do technological carbon removal work. And so we started to do some of this engagement to kind of see where our state chapters are at, if they're having these conversations and what the public discourse might look like. And so we kind of have three different ways of measuring if we go into a state. And so the first way is either that there's been legislation around carbon management proposed in that state. There's a project or multiple projects proposed in that state, or the state has come to us and said, you guys have expertise in this and we're hearing things, can you have a conversation with us? And so that was the case in both Wyoming and Louisiana. And so both of them are very kind of like premier first adopter states of CCS. And so Wyoming is a state that has a very long oil, gas, coal history that they're very dependent on. I learned a lot from our Wyoming chapter and affiliates, and it's something that the state is very proud of for the most part, and that they are subsidized by the government because they export this energy to the rest of the country. And it would be remiss of me to not quote, our public lands director who lives and works in Wyoming, and he says, after if Wyoming was its own country, we would be like the third largest exporter of energy. And he says that every time we go on a call. But I think it just goes to show that Wyoming has a reputation of being an energy-based state, and it's something that they take pride in. It's also a place where there's been some R&D testing that's been done, a lot of the enhanced oil recovery that uses CO2 to pump more oil out of the ground. Most of those CO2 pipelines that exist in the country exist in Wyoming. So they are one of the few places that already kind of has this suite of infrastructure that does exist. They also have Class 6 primacy, which is the permission from the EPA that allows them to permit their own Class 6 wells. So Wyoming is kind of like a perfect cocktail for people who want to do CCS. And for the most part, because they're a heavily industrial state, people, want the industry to remain there so they can keep those jobs. At the same time, you get a lot of very large conversation across the country about, environmental justice and environmental justice communities and issues. And sometimes we'll talk to people that are working in industry and they say, well, Wyoming doesn't have environmental justice communities because of the way that I think that we've started to label the conversation. It's become a very racialized type of conversation, as it should, because environmental racism is a key component of this. But I think the largely white Wyoming population said, well, we don't have any brown people here, so we don't have any environmental justice issues. And it's kind of like, well, the Wind River Reservation is the second largest Native American reservation in the country, and it's in the state of Wyoming. So you think that there aren't issues with access or energy. And so it's been kind of, interesting to have conversations because, as I think they pointed out earlier on the previous panel, is that not all communities are monoliths either. So the indigenous tribes that live on the Wind River Reservation have also benefited from fossil infrastructure, that they have taken part in that historically. So maybe that lends itself to the CCS boom happening in Wyoming, that there are agreements and commitments and co-development that can happen with those tribes because they've seen this before. Maybe that involvement in previous fossil industry makes them more hesitant to engage in CCS because they've been burned before by those industries. So there's a lot to think about there. aware, we have a tribal program at NWF, and so we talk a lot internally about when you're working on project development, about free, prior, and informed consent. So if I'm giving consent for a project, is it free? You haven't bought me out, bought my family out. Is it prior? Did you talk about this ahead of time, or am I walking into the vote when you tell me to show up? And informed, do I have all of the resources and access to the resources that I need to make an informed decision with my community? And so Wyoming is a great example, I think, of a place where people think maybe EJ is not a really big deal, but it depends on what perspective you're looking at, and I realize I'm talking a lot, but the next state is Louisiana, and I think that many of us that are familiar with the carbon management or emerging technology space have heard about what's going on in Louisiana, that Louisiana is a really kind of battleground area for carbon management. And when you look at the history of environmental racism and just racism in politics as a whole in the state of Louisiana, you understand why people feel like vehemently about the emerging technologies there, and why people are so hesitant to engage. Because I can understand that if you have a person knocking at your door who looks a lot like the last person who was knocking at your door, promising you really good stuff that didn't really actually get delivered on, and in fact actually gave you cancer, then I think you'd be really hesitant to look and accept someone who looks a lot like that last guy promising something completely different, or really not that different. So I think that you have to do a lot of consideration around the historic infrastructure in these places, and considering the blights maybe that they've had, or the contributions that have been bad on the communities. And I think something we have to start doing as the carbon management sphere is taking these concerns a lot more seriously. And you know, it may not be a concern to you, but if it's a concern to someone, it has to be addressed, right? And I think that's why I'm not an engineer anymore and I work in policy, is because engineers are like, well, why not address people's concerns? I can build it. And so, you know, we've done a lot of work with the Louisiana Wildlife Federation talking about sequestration. There's been a lot of projects that for whatever reason want to sequester CO2 under lakes, for example. And these are recreational places, they're places for wildlife. Louisiana's wetlands are incredibly important, not only to their ecology, but to also how the state handles climate. So it's not, you know, a coincidence that we see the degradation of their wetlands and also like they can't handle a hurricane anymore. So the Louisiana Wildlife Federation has played a really great role in trying to talk to communities. They've been open to discussing carbon management. They're trusted actors in the community, because they recognize that Louisiana is a really industrial state. And there has to be something that's done about those industries and those unabated emissions, but at the same time trying to conserve wildlife and protect the communities that are really afraid of the technology transition. So those are two very long examples. But
No, thank you. They both had very different things going on, but it was great to kind of see that. Any other thoughts on sort of the stakeholder challenges and what you know, categories of stakeholders are out there, and then we can move on to how we might, you know, address some of those challenges. But is there anything else we want to say on the challenges?
I can just offer one example, kind of from the middle of the country, which is some of the significant long pipelines that have been proposed in the Midwest. And I think there you have something of a you know, an alliance. I'm all for bipartisan action. I like it when people with disparate views get together. Here, I don't know if I'm as enthusiastic, but it's kind of people on the environmental perspective who are against CCS as a fall solution. I think climate change is very important, but this is not something that should happen. In an alliance with people, I think largely farmers, some of whom I got to see at a PHMSA hearing in Iowa, who my sense was, I didn't, you know, I may be wrong about this, but my sense was climate not emitting CO2, maybe particularly not emitting CO2 from ethanol production, was not a priority. So the pipeline to them was just like government eminent domain to support a tax credit that was going to make a few people rich and, you know, required to go through their land. And that, you know, understandably was like off-putting, to say the least. Anyway, that
Right,
sort
other
of
flavor.
like, there are places where you have both of those groups working together, and that has been challenging.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, I just say that one of the little challenge. So we're on top.
Are you sure?
I am. Okay, we're gonna get to it.
Okay. I think but like both what Ben and Simone are saying, it's just, it like goes back to what you pointed to, which is the diversity of stakeholders that exist on this issue. You know, the issue with landowners, the issue with environmental activists, frontline communities, folks who may be disproportionately harmed, whether it be because something is being done or something is not being done, because there is a cost in inaction as well. And I think there's also, you know, rural communities that have been burned by different, not just developers actually, even by the federal government. So there's just a lot of mistrust out there that, and each stakeholder, the way they approach what is being offered to them is going to be different. And the issues that fundamentally, I think what communities want to know is like, is this technology solution going to solve the problem that I have? And that's the part I think we're not quite answering well, because we kind of operate in silos, and you know, we believe this technology is good and this is bad. Like, so we're not offering them the solution that to their problem. And I think that's the shift that we need.
Yeah, and then just the last thing that I'll say on that Meteron brings up a really good point. And I was a part of a conversation between environmental justice advocates and NGOs, environmental groups, and also the federal government, and the facilitator, who was really wonderful human rights lawyer, which just goes to show like the nature of the discourse on this issue, that it has to be, you know, facilitated by a human rights lawyer from the Philippines. That, you know, she used this great analogy that I really put in perspective, and I always love to share with people, is she brought a wooden spoon, and she was like, you know, what do you think of when someone shows you a wooden spoon? And somebody was like, oh, my Italian grandmother, and stirring the pasta with her as a child, and it's a wonderful memory. And she points to another person, what do you think of when I show you a wooden spoon? It's like, that's the switch that my granny beat me with whenever I was in trouble, sort of thing. So it was a funny example to say that an object that seems completely benign has very, very different reactions for different people, and that your lived experience is going to, you know, push you to generate whatever reaction you have. So just as it would be invalid to say, well, you should like wooden spoons because my grandma cooked with them, even though yours beat you with it, is like, it's not a thing that you can say because it is based off of someone's reality. And so I think that is something that we have to consider as we take this technology, oftentimes as advocates of the technology and its infrastructure, into these communities. That for me, CCS is, you know, cooking with my grandma in the kitchen, and for someone else, it's a switch. So I think, you know, that is a way that we really have to start thinking about different people's perspectives. So I just love that analogy. So I just want to share.
So I'm wondering your all perspective on what sorts of best practices that you think might be useful in engaging, you know, having productive discussions, and also, you know, you several of you have talked about kind of gaining trust and understanding it, and I think part of that is being open yourself to understanding that maybe this isn't the best solution in this particular instance, and so I'm wondering how, as somebody who may be advocating for a technology, you address that and can actually kind of understand those concerns and maybe come out with a different perspective. So if you all have thoughts to share on that, I'd be interested.
I'd love to just talk a little bit about our community engagement process at Folsom. We operate cement kilns. We also have other kinds of operations that are noisy or bothersome, or, you know, otherwise require a good, solid, ongoing relationship with the surrounding communities, so that everyone is happy with the outcomes. And so, well, just to be brief, we have every one of our facilities has a community engagement plan. Our larger facilities have community advisory councils that meet on a regular basis when there isn't a problem. Also when there is a problem, but the important part is it's an ongoing relationship and an ongoing conversation. So that when there is something new to discuss, we're not running out and trying to find, you know, the community. We're there, we operate in the community, and we may need to find more of the community, but we're not starting cold with any particular kind of conversation. So, you know, I think the other piece to add to it, is something that is newer to Wholesome. Since the J screening tools came out, particularly the CEQs tool, we've asked each one of our plan managers to look at their community through that lens as they're developing their community engagement plans. Step one, right, is knowing who's in your community. Step two is knowing what your vulnerabilities are. And I really appreciated what you said about environmental justice, obviously being completely connected to environmental racism, but not the whole concept. Otherwise, we would just call it environmental racism. So a lot of our facilities operate in areas that are not particularly diverse. And
Yeah, Utah really wasn't giving me that.
right, yeah, Utah, Florence, Colorado, like, I mean, yes. So St. Genevieve, not particularly diverse.
As Missouri, yeah.
So so here's the thing, right? Those communities have vulnerabilities still, right? They have vulnerabilities with all kinds of things, whether it's educational, economic, infrastructure, climate resilience, and susceptibility to climate risk. And so what we have asked our plant managers to do when they look at community engagement and plans for making a positive contribution to the community is to know who's in your community and know what the community vulnerabilities are, and to be able to explain how our activities in the community are reflective of those realities and how we are going to make a positive contribution. So when it comes time to hopefully install carbon capture in St. Genevieve or Florence or Devilside or wherever, Ravenna, that'd be great. We wouldn't be having a cold start, right? It doesn't mean that it wouldn't be controversial. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't have to problem solve with the communities that are relevant to that facility. But it's a lot better if you've got a track record of collaboration.
Anyone else want to add before we turn it over to questions?
I can just offer one example that I feel like I am a lawyer. I don't know how to do community engagement particularly, so I will go on two people, one of whom has been at Clean Air Task Force one time and is wonderful. I'm not sure whether we really are experts at community engagement either. But his thought is we really need to identify what communities value and then work with them on those issues that they value, and that may differ in different places. And the one example I've seen, which seemed quite interesting and kind of harkens back to what Eric was describing in terms of Orsted's job training, was an area in rural Louisiana, Vernon Parish, where a company trying to do CO2 storage has a project that they're working on with the local school, which needed career readiness technical, getting it wrong, CTE training for students who were not college bound, who the high school didn't have any of that. They were really wanted more of their student body to have job prospects in the area, working with the union, the capture point company that's doing the CO2 storage and pipeline and needs a lot of welders the same way Orsted needs a lot of wind turbine technicians, is doing a 2-year, multiple 2-year programs, but job training for these students who, do their normal high school, but then also go and learn how to weld. And I I didn't get to go to it, but I saw like the videos of the induction ceremonies, and these families were really so clearly pleased, but so fortunate about the opportunity that was being provided. That seems like a really great example of where the community value was identified. You know, I guess this is a community benefit project, although I don't think they're getting DOE money, so it's just they're doing it themselves. A really good instance. It may be different elsewhere. We need to make sure that somebody does the outreach to know what the community wants. I think that could help.
Finding alignment between, like, starting with the goals and then finding alignment. Interesting perspective. Well, I'll turn it over to the audience, and one kind of big picture topic that I had hoped to throw out there, but we didn't quite have enough time for it. So if there's an audience question on it, I would be happy to hear it. Is about the IRA, and if there's anything specific about the IRA that you think is worth mentioning, or asking the audience about how CCS fits in with that, and what opportunities, challenges, etc. Might be there. So, yes.
So first of all, Simone, Charles Franklin, American Chemistry Council. Thank you for calling out chemistry. It's very important. On the IRA side, I think building off of this idea of finding a way to reconcile these climate goals, I think really aggressive, critical climate goals, with this need to actually be working with communities. I think one of the things that has been, I think, kind of a journey for a lot of companies to understand is the community benefits plan, the Justice 40, and this the kind of basically the framework that the administration has applied to basically project selection, project design, and so setting that as a predicate, but it also seems we also to see is part of that is we need to work with the community and give them what they want or what they need to have them feel like this is something that they can do. My question is, what do you do? And I was down at the Energy Justice Conference in Texas, in Louisiana. What do you do when the community, there's nothing you can get that's going to be done? Oh, and I think the related part is for the areas. Do you feel like that model is getting projects selected in the right places? And the pace that we need to actually make IRA.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the $1 million question, honestly, is, you know, the $1 trillion question. When a community says no, kind of, you know, how do you respond? And I think that when we look at, you know, someone in the earlier session brought up the HIMA's principles and thinking about like the principles of environmental justice and free, prior, and informed consent. There's a lot of conversation about renegotiation and trying to figure out if there are ways to not necessarily circumnavigate a no, but figuring out what was wrong with the original plan that caused people to say no. And sometimes it's not always completely obvious. And I think that's why we have to kind of dig deep in these community conversations, because sometimes communities just say, no, I don't want CCS infrastructure. And it takes a little bit of saying, okay, what is it about CCS infrastructure that you don't like? And it's saying, oh, well, I actually really don't like that this industrial facility emits these code blues. Okay, well, directing them to Clean Air Task Force, and GPI has a report about it as well, and thinking about what can we do as a company to ensure people feel like they're supported in this response to code blues. So is there education we can do around what CCS can do as far as code blues? Can we provide trusted actors and NGOs in the community with with citizen science methods to track their own blues, to say, we're not even going to promise you this, but we'll help give you the tools so you can measure it and see yourself. So I think that it's like, it does take, and one of the last things I was going to say about these challenges is, I think, and one of the reasons, again, I'm just, shitting all over engineering, but one of the reasons I left engineering was because it was such like a linear perspective from point A to point B. And I think that carbon management and navigating these really hard issues, it necessitates thinking outside of the box. And so when we think about what communities don't have, how do I convince a mother who takes public transportation to her job, that has 3 kids, that is worried about putting food on the table, that CCS is important? She doesn't care about that. But you know, if I can show her that CCS reduces co-pollutants, so her kids will have a healthier environment in which to play, maybe they need a park to play in that we could help supply them with. If we can, you know, do things for their schools or do things for their public transportation networks, so she's not on the bus for 6 hours a day. You know, so I think that it's like, we typically operate in this like very linear, it's all about carbon management sort of thing. And so we need to come up with a carbon management plan, but it really is coming up with like a socioeconomic plan for that community to figure out how you can use the skills as a company, as a developer, as a carbon management advocate to also fix all these other problems. And I know that's a very big ask because carbon management didn't create all of these problems. But the point is that if you're coming in and you want that permission, you've got to find a way to fix all the other stuff, even if it's not related or directly related. So I think it does necessitate something outside of the box. I realize that's sort of like a non-answer. But I think that it's useful and something that we've learned. And the last thing I'll say, because I talk a lot, is that like thinking about asset-based community engagement. So we think a lot of times, and it is important to think about what communities lack, because oftentimes that's where barriers are. But also thinking about what communities have is really important, and what they feel proud about and what they care about, and leveraging those tools that they have in place in order to help them reach where you want to be for a community engagement plan.
So I'm gonna ask a tough question.
Not $1 billion.
And so I've spent my life on chemical plant safety and additive rules. So I think there's a paradox of conversation and an opportunity. And when you go to communities, they talk about regular accidents, you know, that's happening every day. We talk about co-pollutants, right? So I think the opportunity is not talked about a CCS conversation. They're talk about a holistic conversation, right? There is a chemical plant safety rule right now that the industry is opposing a technology-based safer alternatives. The industry has historically pushed back against them, right? So I think that one of the problems that I see is segmenting this conversation. So going to the community, I'm talking about fence line communities who have borne the brunt of mismanagement. So you can't go to them about CCS. You have to go to them, how can they be benefited, right? So we have to join these conversations. Right now, we have the chemical industry and its lobbyists opposing major elements of the chemical safety rule, despite the data of regular accidents. And they're trying to convince the same communities that CCS is the best thing since sliced bread. That's just a false proposition, right? And if you really want to have an honest conversation, it's not just co-polluting, it's have a broader conversation about how do you join these issues that communities are experiencing on the ground.
Anybody have comments on that?
I'll just offer, I've often felt like we're fighting about CCS sort of because it's the easy thing, and I guess it's new and it's like out there, in the public, and you can get kind of traction on it. But I feel like if to the extent the issues that are most worrisome are public health issues, focusing on those ones, I know nothing about the rules, so not at all expert. And maybe that's part of the problem, that a lot of the big green groups were focused on climate and not spending enough time thinking about each issues. But to me, I feel like if we could take some of the effort that's going to this battle and just focus it on, okay, how do we make sure that we're reducing the pollutants that are most causing the health harms, and then let the climate people go do their climate thing. I feel like, aren't we going to get closer to solving the problems that are kind of animating the friction we're fighting over the CCS? Anyway, so I think an agreement that I'm not sure if it's combining the two, but it's also at least to say, let's make sure we tackle those pollutants directly rather than sort of trying to get at them through climate, or this plant has to close down because it's a CO2 emitter, and that's how we're going to get our hazardous air pollutant reductions. Let's just get the hazardous air pollutant reductions. We're probably not going to shut the plant down. Probably CCS on the plant to deal with the CO2, because we still need our cement, especially if we want the pilings for the renewables. anyway, just, I'm agreeing, maybe incoherently.
I think it's an issue with disenfranchisement, honestly, it's like, these are issues in, once again, my engineering friends would be like, these are issues with democracy, is really what all of this comes down to. And CCS, like Ben said, is a mechanism through which people are voicing their disdain for the lack of democratic processes and the lack of being able to use those levers as people. I talked about this with a colleague of mine that I said, it's not just CCS, look at the healthcare system. COVID exacerbated things that marginalized people already knew was there. Those issues that already existed within the healthcare system. So what we see is this like backlash now because of COVID is a democratic issue. And so I think that that's what we're facing now as a larger society, is a democratic issue, but the subject is climate. And so CCS is a really kind of low-hanging fruit in order to pick on, to talk about how I feel disenfranchised in this entire process of figuring out how we're going to solve climate issues. And this is a close thing for me to lean on to say. And it's not to say those concerns aren't real, but I think that's truly, if we're digging deep, I think that the issue is with democracy.
All right, well, on that great note, one last, yeah.
Well, it may be a big one. No, I just wanted to build on what you were saying, Simone, in terms of how can you educate people about CCS at scale? Because that's one of the, and you can't be in a condescending way. And I don't think industry is going to be trusted, to your point, Maddie, to come forward and do that, even though industry has the solutions. What strikes me is this massive gap between the technical aspects, which are really solvable and proven, and the fact that people have all these misconceptions and they're afraid of it, even in very conservative communities like Louisiana, right? Where you think they'd be crying out for it. So how can you educate people at scale, and how do you get the funding? How do you make that happen? Big question. Maybe it's just one to leave in the air.
I'd like to just throw a challenge out there to my friends and colleagues in the NGO sector, because I do think companies have a role to play, but you're right, Bob, there's a lot of limitations on how much of that message people are going to accept from a company that ultimately wants to undertake the technology. But I don't think the conversation about CCS is really being had in a fulsome way. Outside the private sector, or sort of the specific public policy conversation, all of these issues, I mean, if we have to talk about democracy, let's talk about democracy, but we're running out of time. And so shying away from it and being reticent to discuss, to your point, what problem are we trying to solve? If we're trying to solve for hazardous air pollutants, let's solve for hazardous air pollutants. It is way past time to deal with that. If we're trying to solve for carbon dioxide, which is not a hazardous air pollutant in the regulatory sense, but super hazardous, I think, for all of us, right? Let's talk about that. But I think the worst thing to do is to not talk about it. To talk about other things that are safer where we agree more, that is not helping this conversation. And so I think that's on all of us, right? But if you care about climate, if you care about communities, if you're in this room or listening to this panel online, for heaven's sake, talk about it. I think that's the thing we can do the most of.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. This has been really enlightening to me, but hopefully to all of you and everybody listening. So with that, I think we'll change guards and thanks to all of you. I think we can be. Thank you all. Yeah.
Talking.
That's all we can. I'm here. I know. Yeah. They know I don't need it. Because you was everything.
That's right. That was good. That was good. No, I think good. How are you? Yeah, I'm a trustee. I hear myself. You don't speak, you don't write.
Yeah.
For the common accountability. Right. That was great.
Awesome. It was nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too so much. I was gonna say. Oh, I am quite sure, I'm quite sure that it would. Yeah. I'm really excited. Like, thinking some. It was the first time I was so excited. And that was the last time. The conference is going well. Last panel, there was a really good discussion. Carbon CCS. And I think this panel will be well played for. And it's going to kind of talk about the issues that they matter most in the market-based mechanism space and accounting space. But I think there's enough here that we can easily fill out.
Super.
Yeah, so,
System.
have a critical breakout sessions, I think the final numbers, the plenary session. Was easily. Plus people in person. Like 5 different. We can do it.
Oh, yeah, great. Sorry.
Yeah, and so I think I started my. You remember the chart? It's like policy, and modules, the policy, global policy, and those were the two. Last time. And then we did come up with like a agreement, like you had to create a screen that measured like things happening, expertise, like the things that we can decide whether or not we have to do 100%. So we can like instead of just chasing cows. Yeah, so it could be like, okay, let's run it through the screen, so let's pass our screen. But like, I was supposed to be. It's good, but I think that is. All any other word. I managed to. I want to ask a question. Someone on the permitting. Yeah, okay. I'm gonna go. I'll you. I mean, this the tough thing about moving is this. Well, I was, I was very definitely going to do the next one. Nobody. Hey. I think I hope you're going to. But then they someone within the. I think that was the first one. I think I'll probably go from the beginning of the reception.
Oh, right.
I try to get out. Really just. I might reply to the idea of not.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry. Yeah, but
Especially with, the balance there.
Yeah.
Her brothers. But across there.
Yeah, you guys should have stayed in engineering.
Yeah.
I would have been happy here.
We're traveling.
Yeah, I really appreciate the transition.
I just stepped in last minute, and.
Really wild, like I thought so much in my
Just
degree. The community aspects and like about policy and understand my advisor, he was like a very standard applied math guy. And it's just like, they have great differential equation. Like, that's your favorite flag. Like, I said, yeah, I remember asking him.
Me too.
Same thing every day. You like, how, you just, you just, and he was like, yeah, I love math. Because I'm good at math, but. It does not fucking go. And I like, y'all are just. So, it was like, yeah, I was. Everybody was like. Continue doing research at NCAR in Boulder, and then I got the job at WF. Instead of national.
I may have to go first since you're in the room and then, you know.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, and then there is like a small community of us, like. And AAAS has done like a really good job of like ushering that transition and like swinging engineers into. So I think a lot of it. That works for us too.
Will make my job easy.
So that's the other. Actually, like. Yeah.
Well, as you were saying that too, I'm thinking, it's so great.
Yeah,
People need to hear that. Thank you for.
I don't think so.
Sure you don't. No, I believe it. No, I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, other half hearing is insane. So we should get started and, when you get control of the unit and it's conference, it's kind of free, this is the panel, this is the panel. Because there's a lot of people online.
Okay, I'm gonna do that. It's been now going to go grab.
Sorry, I'm not gonna do that. I do that.
We need to start a conversation.
Yeah.
Anything you can do.
Just read all your tax contributions for plan that she did. Taking a position publicly supporting the NBC.
That was supposed to be in my library.
Yes, do you mind just talking really quick, just so you can test your line to make sure the name.
It's gonna be like every 4 minutes.
I know, but it definitely needs to.
Yeah, it's really nice.
No, there's a lot of times that I was on phrase.
Yes.
I just want to show you that I have it written down with like the start, but I was going to the ready. Yeah.
I mean, like, if you can't do it. Yes, it's like easy, low hanging fruit.
That timeline. This one, that's what all of us. It was like.
And running through exclusively through.
Yeah. Did it run through tribal reservations?
It ran through some of the most sparsely populated areas.
Actually, kind of similar how market
And-
is. Really?
Oh.
Yeah.
And here's secretaries of states to get.
Just the regulatory services. Get the American. Yeah. No. Yeah.
Big fund engineering funds. Yeah. So I think they're gonna do. Yeah, it's actually.
Yeah. I could tell he was kind of building up to, you know, all we need, now what we need to do is. All everything stuff. Right.
Oh, yeah. Just do it again.
Exactly. So, I've heard him make a version of it.
Honestly,
Yeah.
I think the appropriate.
Yeah, so.
I'm acting.
Yeah.
I would like the argument.
Basically.
Okay. Always.
I know.
Jesse's.
Actually.
Then are you next?
Yeah,
Who this?
It's like.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. We're back at the Green Tech Conference on implementing the IRA and accelerating the energy transition. For those in the audience as well as watching online, you're in the second panel of the track-free carbon track. This panel is focused on measurement, reporting, and verification, offset markets, and net zero accounting. So my name is Juge Gregg. I'm Senior Corporate Counsel for Amazon. I support our worldwide sustainability organization and spend much of my time advising on our decarbonization pathway and efforts, our climate pledge commitment, and work towards that, and as well as supporting our carbon neutralization team as relevant to this work. Wear a few other hats supporting worldwide sustainability, but those are the most relevant ones for this session. And I'll be your moderator today. The job of the moderator, as I see it, is three key roles. I did one really well. I'm going to do one a little bit poorly, and I'm not going to do the third one. The first thing that a moderator and panel organizer should do is pull together an amazing panel of deeply knowledgeable experts. And that I've done. That's the one I did well. The second job is to sort of frame the issue that we're going to talk about. That one I'll probably do poorly. And the third one is to introduce the panelists. That I'm not going to do. I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. So where we are in this panel is we're going to spend some time talking about the net in net zero. There's been a lot of talk about the production and energy pathways and the ramp that we need for renewables and other technologies. This panel is really focusing on the credibility and the transparency of netting out those emissions that can't be decarbonized by mid-century, and how to put in place and what are the gaps and opportunities for improving the measurement, reporting, verification, and accounting of our net zero pathway and the market-based mechanisms. Now, these market-based mechanisms come in a lot of flavors. The one you're probably most familiar with are carbon offsets and the carbon offset market of the regulatory. There are some regulatory markets, some voluntary markets, but underpinning each of those is the measurement, accounting, verification, the transparency of those credits, but also looking beyond just the carbon offset market. There are accounting needs for insets in supply chains on different technologies for book and claim opportunities for capturing and incentivizing a variety of different technologies, from sustainable aviation fuel, more sustainable transportation fuels, and other market-based mechanisms. So the question is, how do we make sure that that is accounted for credibly, done so transparently, and also the actions that we want to see for the benefit of the planet are incentivized. And there's a lot of question about credibility of carbon offset markets. There's a New Yorker article last month entitled "The Great Cash for Carbon Hustle," which sort of delved deeply into one suite of carbon offsets. There's Delta Airlines is facing a putative class action lawsuit questioning the credibility of the carbon offsets that they use to support their carbon claims. There are carbon accounting issues as to how, even if you have a good, credible, verified carbon credit, how that flows through to the both regulatory and voluntary reporting that companies are doing on their carbon pathway. Because right now, for example, greenhouse gas protocol doesn't allow for a mechanism for reporting on offsets. It's focused on the decarbonization pathway. There are regulatory issues that abound, dealing with regulatorily required carbon disclosures, whether it's the draft SEC regulation in the US, the European Green Deal regulations and directives on carbon disclosures happening in Europe, the recently passed California legislation regarding carbon disclosures, as well as another flavor of this is the green claims issues that are governed in the US by the FTC, in Europe there's a green claims directive under development. And those get at some of the claims that literally are sitting right in front of you. If you happen to grab the water bottle this morning, you take a look, there is a claim that appears on this water bottle like 3 or 4 times that it is certified carbon neutral. That claim may be problematic to make in France under recently passed legislation. There is the possibility that claim may be regulated or opined upon by the FTC as part of the FTC's updates for its green guides. And underpinning all of that is the issues we're dealing with today, which is how do we make sure that that claim is credible and supported and actually reflects an impact on the environment. So with that sort of framing of the broad suite of issues that we're going to talk about, I'm going to turn over the last job that I'm supposed to do as moderator to the actual panelists and ask each of them to give a brief introduction of their background as well as the work that they are doing right now that's relevant to this area. And I'll ask each of them to frame up one or two difficult issues in this area and offer a few thoughts on it. And that's going to be our springboard for discussion. I'm going to start with the panelists who are here joining me at the table, going from my far left. And then we have at least one, but potentially two panelists joining us remotely by Zoom. And I'll turn the gavel over, or the microphone over to them after the panelists in the room have started. Cynthia?
Can you hear me? All right, hi everyone. Cynthia Camas. I work at Deloitte, where we work with companies like all across what would say the net zero journey, from measuring their emissions to setting targets to developing their decarbonization strategies to help them think through how they want to participate in the carbon markets, how they do their disclosures, how to prepare for all this climate disclosure rules that are going into effect in the EU, in the US with FCC, and now in California. My background though is I've been at Deloitte a short time. My background, the first half of my career was at EPA, working on various climate voluntary programs with the private sector to find different incentives to get them to reduce their emissions. And then I spent the next 14 years at the World Resources Institute, where I spent the first half of that with the with greenhouse gas protocol, and led the development of numerous greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standards. And then in that role, I co-founded the Science Based Targets Initiative and co-led that for close to 8 years. And if you're not, does everyone know GHG protocol? Does everyone know the Science Based Targets Initiative?
A little bit of background on both.
Okay.
Fantastic.
All right, so the greenhouse gas protocol, shortest explanation is it's become the international standard for how companies and cities and governments as well, how they measure and disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. The corporate standards are probably the best known and most widely used. And then Science-Based Targets Initiative uses greenhouse gas protocol as the foundation, but builds on that and then helps define, looking at the decarbonization scenarios from the IPCC, define what a company's role is in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and defines what a science-based target should look like, and then validates these targets. And the initiative now has spun off and become an independent NGO, and has been has validated, I think now over close to 4,000 targets, and there's close to 6,000 companies that have made a commitment to set a science-based target, and then have 24 months to get the target validated. So it's really grown to be the expected practice for companies that are setting targets. This is the only type of target that really is credible at this point in time. So in regards to the carbon markets, my framing really comes from the Science-Based Targets Initiative and the net zero standard we developed, which defined what net zero means for a company, which is that companies need to decarbonize on the path to net zero in line with science. And when they get to the state of net zero, there still will be what we call residual emissions, and those need to be we call it neutralized with some type of permanent removals, technological or nature-based. And on the path to net zero, companies will continue to have unabated emissions, even if they're decarbonizing in line with science. And those unabated emissions, we've defined as what we recommended, that the companies invest in what we call beyond value chain mitigation. So to continue to unabate those, to abate for those remaining emissions on the path. And that is still not a common practice, that piece of it. But what's important to know is just net zero is essentially, companies need to almost nearly fully decarbonize by 2050 at the latest. And then they will have some small amount of residual emissions that can be neutralized. So the main focus is on mitigation. That is the critical focus that we think companies or that SBTI thinks companies should take. In the carbon market space, I think because of that, and because of GHG protocol saying carbon credits need to be reported separately from your inventory, it's essentially established this practice where companies can't use credits to make any kind of claim of net zero, although some companies are still doing that. So, and these claims of carbon neutral and climate neutral, for various reasons, have a whole host of issues related to them in terms of the lack of credibility of some of the credits themselves, or lack of confidence that companies, or that the whole ecosystem has in these credits. But there's also a lot of lack of credibility in the claim itself for a whole variety of reasons. So SBTI has been trying to move companies away from carbon neutral, climate neutral claims towards what we've been calling beyond value chain mitigation claims. The problem with that is it's not very appealing to companies, and companies are not going to make these investments in carbon credits, even if they were robust, without being able to make some claim that's appealing to their customers. I think that's where we are right now, is that there's not a good claim yet, right, for that. And so companies now are a bit paralyzed, I see. They are moving away from carbon neutral, climate neutral claims. They don't find beyond value chain mitigation claims very appealing. There's the VCMI, which is an NGO called the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, that was set up about 2 years ago, that has this like code of practice where you could go and you'll soon be able to get your claim, this beyond value chain mitigation claim, certified by them, so that you can make a claim, and it includes some type of investment in carbon credits that are in line with the ICBCM, which is it's the Integrity for Carbon Markets initiative. And ICBCM is trying to create the voluntary standard for what credible carbon credits look like. So you have to use that to make this claim. So there's this whole big ecosystem in the voluntary world for companies that is still evolving, and I think will provide more robustness. But it's still unclear what that claim will be. And then one last thing is just, I think what's also become a hindrance is that in Science-Based Targets Initiative, companies have to include their scope 3 emissions. So their emissions both upstream and downstream of their operations in their target boundary, if those emissions are significant, and for most companies they are. So companies are really struggling to get a handle on how are they going to reduce these value chain emissions. And with all their efforts going into that and trying to get a budget approved internally to go after those emissions, they don't really have much funding left over to go and buy these carbon credits. Carbon credits can't be used to reduce scope 3 emissions, according to the SBTI framework. But there are new market mechanisms that are evolving, that are helping companies to try to go after some of these scope 3 emission sources that are deep in their supply chain, far upstream, where they don't have a lot of transparency into them, to enable them to make these investments. And that's a whole new market that is evolving. There's an initiative that I sit on the governance committee for called the AIM platform, and they're trying to come up with an international standard for how to account for these the emission reductions from these scope 3 market mechanisms, such as SAF that you've heard about, biogas certificates, other types of investments like that. So I think the market is still has a lot of work to do to evolve, to provide the right incentive and credibility that companies need in order to make these investments.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. This is a perfect introduction to where I come from, because I work at the World Bank. I'm Flavia Rosenbusch, and you know the World Bank is an international organization. Our mandate is to Hi. So the bank's mandate is to alleviate poverty in a livable planet. So our client countries are developing countries. So how do we look at carbon markets? The bank has been working on carbon markets for over 20 years. And I joined the bank many years ago, many years ago, when we were setting up the first carbon fund, which was called the prototype carbon fund. And we set it up before the Kyoto Protocol even entered into force. So we had participants in that fund that were from the private sector, that were from the public sector, and we worked very closely with our client countries to help them develop the projects that then could give rise to credits. Then going forward, we set up a number of carbon funds. Some of them are still active. And now we are very, very involved in carbon markets, mostly trying to help our client countries figure out what they can be doing, but also trying to help the market itself become more transparent. Where I come from is I'm a lawyer by background. I spent a number of years in private practice. I worked on M&A and I worked on private finance. And I was a corporate lawyer with a soft spot for environmental issues. And I realized carbon markets was exactly where I should be working. I was a visiting professor at Columbia for some time, and then I started working at the bank on these funds. And I thought, oh my God, this feels like being Robin Hood and helping the poor, and it's so exciting because carbon markets is a very, very exciting work. When the carbon markets stalled for a bit, I moved to IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank. And there I was working on blended finance and gender issues, still on climate, but more just on renewable projects. And very recently, I got a call back from my old colleague saying, come back to the bank. This is the time, carbon markets are booming, everybody's looking at it, we have a lot of work to do. So now I'm back at the bank, I'm managing a fund that is mainly providing our client countries with the tools, with support, with technical assistance for them to implement carbon pricing instruments. So we deal with the dirty word carbon taxes, but if our client countries want to take a look at a carbon tax, we're going to provide support for that. As Jude was saying, we also work on crediting mechanisms, we work on ETFs, emissions trading schemes, and more, we see the other side of the coin, which is our client countries saying, wait a minute, we keep having people knocking at our door saying, sell us the credits. What credits can we sell? How does it work with the Paris Agreement? Because for the first time, developing countries also have to comply with their obligations under the Paris Agreement, and they have to produce their national inventory. So they are very confused by, wait a minute, do I authorize the companies that are sitting either in my country or companies that are coming from abroad to develop projects in my country? How is that going to affect my own inventory? Is it better for me to sell these credits or to allow companies to sell these credits now in the voluntary market, or is it better for me to wait until these credits become authorized under the international framework, under the Paris framework, because the price is then going to go up? What do we do? So then that's the other big piece of our work lately, is helping developing countries navigate what is in it for them, which at the end of the day is what we care about. How can we support developing countries? So there's mainly three big pillars that we're looking at the moment. One is helping bring transparency and integrity to the market, exactly what Cynthia was saying. How can we work together with the other actors, with BCMI, ICBCM, science-based targets? How can we facilitate and what can we bring to the table to help on bringing high quality integrity to the market. Another big piece of work we are doing, which I think is super interesting, is we're working with UNIDROIT and UNCITRAL, with the UN organizations that have a mandate to provide legislation on coming up with general principles on the legal nature of voluntary carbon credits. And those general principles, we hope we are then going to be able to share with our client countries and say, these are the things you need to think about. Do you want this to be a property right? Do you want this to be a commodity? Is this a security? How you end up determining that the nature of your carbon credit is going to have a series of consequences, so you really need to think about it. And you want to make sure that it's transferable, that you can create security over it. And we're also working with IOSCO, which is the international organization for financial regulators, to provide financial integrity to the carbon market. So looking at the legal nature of the credit and also looking at what financial regulators may need to look at, and when does IOSCO think they should intervene if there's things going on in their market that shouldn't be going on or that they should be aware of. And the other big pillar that we're working on is policy and institutions. It's part of our bread and butter. We provide support to our client countries on what kind of policy they should be adopting, what institutional framework they should have in place. And for that, we have a number of initiatives, and we can get into more details if you're interested. And the other big part, super interesting part of what we do is working on infrastructure. So we are working on digital MRV, and we're working on an ecosystem called the Climate Warehouse, where all the registries can connect, and it's like a data repository so that registries can talk to each other. So we're providing that open source, and we are talking to our client countries and also to Vera and other private standards to see how we can bring everybody under these platforms so that we can facilitate transparency from an infrastructure registry point of view. And then finally, the final part of our work is, as you can see, we want to help create high quality credits. We want to help create a good registry transparency. We want to help create strong institutional and policy frameworks, and then we want to help monetize these emission reductions. So we have a very, I think, a flagship facility, which is called the Forestry Carbon Partnership Facility, that has created carbon assets from forestries and has monetized them on behalf of our client countries. So we also help create credits that are not necessarily under the Paris Agreement yet, or these are jurisdictional crediting systems. So we also look at the bank's operations to see if we could be helping create credits from banks' operations or from some facilities that we also run. And I think there's lots of information, so let me stop here. Back to you.
Great, and I'm gonna hand the floor over to Chris Davis first, and JP, you're gonna get to that cleanup. And the mandate is to introduce yourself and the work that you're doing. And Chris, I think your recent transition, so you can pick either current or past work to talk about, and finally tee up a sort of tough issue in this area and offer your thoughts on it. And then once we've done this round of introductions, we'll move into crosstalk and folks can engage on some of the issues that have raised. So Chris, floor is yours.
Thanks, Jude. Hello, everyone. Sorry to be remote. I was hoping to be in the room with you all, but couldn't make it happen. In part, as Jude alluded, I made a bit of a transition recently when we started this process. I was a colleague to Jude at Amazon. I headed up the sustainability practice on our international public policy team. And as part of that, spent a lot of time working on some of the voluntary standards revisions processes that are underway right now. You heard Cynthia referring to both the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science-Based Target Initiative, both of which are undergoing sort of public processes to update and revise. And so I led a lot of that work, and in so doing, collaborated a lot with Jude and others in the company to identify some of the challenges that we at Amazon as a large both emitter but also implementer of reduction strategies we're facing within those standards. Since then, I've left and I've come over to Carbon Cure, which is a much smaller, as most things are, than Amazon, solutions provider. It's a climate tech company that works on decarbonizing the building sector by working to cut carbon from cement and concrete production. So in that sense, still very heavily involved in carbon markets, but more from the side of trying to scale and expand solutions in the marketplace rather than from the side of a major emitter trying to find the right pathways to reduce. So I thought what I would try to do today to build on what you've heard from Flavia and Cynthia is to share a little bit of the kind of practitioner's perspective on some of these processes that are underway, and then happy to try to plunge into these a little more deeper during the conversation. And to that, I guess, three sort of observations that I would offer, particularly building on Cynthia's comments about where we are on some of these standards. First off, if you're not familiar, or even if you are, with GHGP and SBTI and some of the other acronyms that she shared, I think one of the interesting things, especially from someone like me who comes from a policy background, is the degree to which these voluntary frameworks are outsized in their influence on shaping corporate behavior right now. Those of us who think about designing I came from government before I was at Amazon, who think about trying to shape public corporate behavior through regulation, in some ways can only look enviously at the way that some of these entities, which started off as, in many cases, sort of humble nonprofit organizations seeking to kind of provide guidance for corporate action, have really become crucial players in determining the incentives that companies respond to when they think about how to take action on climate. And I think the challenge there is that in many ways, for the most part, although I think this is beginning to change positively, most of these groups have not had either the governance or the governance structures to really manage that kind of role, nor have they necessarily had historically a great set of avenues for practitioner perspectives to feed into those processes. And yet, as you heard from Jude earlier on, we're seeing an unusual situation where the rapid growth of regulations, both in Europe and in the US, intended to bring transparency and integrity to corporate reporting in this area, are often referencing within statute some of these bodies and some of these protocols and sources of guidance, which I think just sort of further heightens the attention and the concern and the importance of really ensuring that these are both effective sources of guidance, but that they are governed and managed in a way that is up to the task. So that's I think that's the first observation. Second, I guess I wanted to point out is, and again, some of you, I think this will be almost too obvious to warrant, but corporate accountability, as it's often talked about in the context of these claims and in the context of this sort of reporting, is measured across all three scopes 1, 2, and 3. So a company's direct emissions, its indirect emissions from the electricity sector, and its indirect emissions from the rest of its supply chain. In most cases, for most big companies and for many smaller ones, scope 3 is the largest of these, or it will be the largest of these as we continue to make progress on reducing scope 2 emissions through renewable energy proliferation. And I think this is a problem that we might want to spend a little bit of time dwelling on for two reasons. Number one, scope 3 emissions for a company like Amazon or a company like Boeing or Archer Daniels Midlands, who have big global supply chains. Those emissions are by definition outside of their control. They are indirect. They are sometimes visible within a supply chain, more often than not buried deep at levels tier 2, tier 3 to tier 4 of a supply chain. And so difficult to both get your hands on from a visibility perspective. Often the data that we use to quantify those emissions are models. They might be based on company spend. They might be based on economy-wide emissions factors, but they're often generalizations that make for inconsistent reporting and quantification of scope 3 emissions across different companies, which makes comparability between companies very difficult to do. The second problem with the scope 3 structure is that, and Cynthia alluded to this, the standards bodies by and large do not provide guidance on how companies seeking to make investments in those value chains, the investments that produce emissions reductions, are to take credit from or quantify the results of those things. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but I think the notion that the standards bodies really compel companies who want to be high integrity about this, to take responsibility across all 3 scopes, while also defining the third scope in a way that makes it both the largest, the hardest to find, and the scope for which we have the least tools to actually make progress on, is a conundrum that I think is worth spending some time on. And then the third piece, which is I think very related to this, is that I think what I would suggest is that the standards bodies, given kind of my first 2 points, really haven't kept up as companies have been able to innovate on the strategies that they need to meet their goals. And so you've heard already references to the expanding growth of market-based mechanisms, moving beyond what many of us have been familiar with over time, RECs in the renewable energy sector, but into carbon credit type programs that might be aimed at accelerating, say, the proliferation of sustainable aviation fuel, or low carbon maritime fuel, or renewable diesel in the on-road transport fleets across the continent. There's a lot happening in the space. A lot of it relies on creating market tools that allow companies, frankly, to overcome the reality that those technologies are here today, but they aren't very well distributed. They aren't available to a company with a supply chain that spans North America or even more globally. And so what does a company with that kind of spread do when access to those sorts of resources is spotty? We want an incentive system that helps companies move forward despite that market fragmentation and helps to correct for it. The current system, which compels companies to drill down as deep into their own value chains through all 3 scopes, in lieu of making investments into market transformation and improving the availability and the access to these technologies, even if they can't be directly connected to their supply chain, I think is a real challenge for us, and one that's slowing down the opportunities we have for corporations to speed the pace of decarbonization. So happy to talk more about that as well. But those are sort of 3 areas where I think companies, more so than the NGOs involved, are struggling.
Thanks, Chris. JP?
Hey, Juge, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thanks.
Fantastic. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much, Juge and Eli, for inviting me to speak. And just like Chris, my apologies for not being there in person. I had to travel to Houston today because, my firm is hosting an energy transition conference. So I am, juggling the 2 events at the same time. But I am very happy that I was able to join you virtually. So my name is JP Brisson. I started my career in the climate change energy transition space in 1998 when I graduated with an LLM in Washington, and I joined the World Bank. Actually, I was the first lawyer to work on the climate finance unit, where Flavia is currently, heading a fund. At the time, the unit had, no more than 8 individuals. It was a very small unit. But the World Bank was and has been extremely successful at catalyzing, interest in the space, and very quickly in the early 2000, raised about $2.6 billion in its various funds to deploy in emission reduction opportunities in developing countries. So that is how I started my career. My experience includes setting up the environmental products desk at Goldman Sachs in 2007. For the purpose of, creating and trading environmental commodities, including carbon credits, those in Europe under the European Union emissions trading system, and those in, from the North American markets, including the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast. I am currently leading the energy transition team at Latham & Watkins. We have about 50, 60 lawyers who spend the majority of their time working with clients on a global level to assist the client in achieving their energy transition goals. And I'll talk to you a little more about what we do, but we cover the spectrum of activities and measures that clients may have to look at. Companies and emitters, banks, may have to look at to achieve their net zero commitment, over the long term. So in terms of the topics that are on my mind going into 2023, 24, 25. There's actually a lot of those, right? So I think we talked about the voluntary, carbon market, right? And the trade winds that are facing the market, that the market is currently facing. I've been in this market for 25 years. I think this is probably, the most critical time for the market in terms of, how, what's going to happen over the next 12 months will ultimately kind of shape up, where the market's going to be long term. But, there is definitely a need to step back and assess, to what extent there are credits out there in the voluntary carbon markets that do not meet, minimum criteria of environmental integrity. And those credits should be purged from the market one way or the other. I think that action is necessary for the market to regain confidence in the voluntary carbon credits. And I think this is an exercise that industry needs to start, and has already to some extent started. In terms of reduction, I thought it was interesting, Chris, that you talked about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and said like there are a lot more scope 3 emissions than there are scope 1 and 2. And coming from Amazon, right? That's correct. I will tell you that most of my clients who are in the energy space, right, have scope 1 emissions that are very, very significant, right? So, and let's face it, right? Every scope 3 emission of Amazon is someone else's scope 1 emission, right? So of course there are more scope 3 emissions because everyone has the scope 3 emission that represent the scope 1 emissions of a supply chain partner or a customer, right? So for some companies, addressing scope 1 emission is still a very significant challenge. And I would postulate that this is probably the case for most of the energy companies. In the US right now, it is probably the most active investment opportunity globally for the energy transition. That is the result of President Trump, yes, you've heard me right, adopting amendments to the 45Q when he was in the White House. And what President Trump adopted as measures was significantly enhanced by the Inflation Reduction Act adopted by President Biden. And that statute has resulted in a flurry of investment, which are continuing to this date in the energy space in the US for the purpose of decarbonizing the energy space. And I am specifically referring to carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, and ammonia. So I am here in Houston today. We have 150 people in a room, from the energy sector in Houston, who did not believe climate change existed 10 years ago, and you are now talking about massive multi-billion-dollar investment in their space for the purpose, not of meeting the climate change treaty of the Paris Agreement, right? For the purpose of generating tax credits, earning a return, and ensuring that, on a long-term basis, that their business is viable. So the shift in the US in particular around the focus of the energy with respect to the long-term viability of the sector and the need to decarbonize as being extremely significant. That's partly due because of the IRA, which I just mentioned. It is also due because of the things that Chris mentioned just now, which are those voluntary initiatives that are pressing the private sector to make long-term commitments with respect to greenhouse gases and act upon them. So to me, like going forward, that's definitely an issue that's at the top of my mind, and I think these investments will continue significantly over the next 5 to 10 years, and would love to talk about this as we continue. And I think I'll leave it at that, Juge. If we want to take some questions, we'd be happy to participate in a discussion.
Great, thanks. I will start by asking whether the panelists had any immediate reaction to the other panel presentations. If not, I've got a question to tee up, but any immediate responses, reactions? Okay, so I'm going to start by asking you all to put on, you're all working deeply in this space, working on these issues, put on your critic's hat of what are some of the best or highest profile critiques of this space, because I think those are some of the things that are driving some of the tensions that we've all flagged in our discussion today. And I want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time exploring those before moving potentially to some of the opportunities and needs for reform. Just jump in, yeah.
Well, so I led so when I was at Avera, I led the development of the Scope 3 accounting and reporting standard, but I will now criticize how things have evolved. So when we developed the standard, we assumed that soon after the standard was developed, we create demand for transparency in supply chains so that companies would understand when they look at especially their purchased goods and services, what the emissions were truly like, so they could see all the way up the supply chain. But what's happened is those tools have been really slow to evolve, and companies, as we've talked about, in that category of emissions for many brand name companies, that's the majority of their emissions. The purchased goods and services. So all the inputs to the goods and services they manufacture or sell. And companies are eager to, now thousands of companies have science-based targets. They're trying to meet these targets, and most of their emissions are in Scope 3. So they're looking frantically for figuring out how are they going to get at these Scope 3 emissions, and they don't have a lot of insight into where these deep supply chain emissions are because of this lack of transparency, lack of good data and tools. And so now companies are now sort of getting ahead of the standards, GHG protocol and SBTi in particular. And so they want to make investments, but they don't know if it's going to count or not. So there's a lot of companies that are moving ahead, but most companies are kind of waiting and seeing for the standards to be updated to see how it will incorporate or enable companies to make these Scope 3 investments, and whether they'll count towards whether they can include them in their inventory and whether they count towards the target. So that's just a problem that we're seeing right now, how companies are moving faster than the standards.
Hey, Jude,
yeah,
I was just gonna say, I might follow up and say, one critique I think probably many of us are familiar with is that companies pursue things, at least offsets when we talk about credits, but maybe credits more generically as well, in lieu of doing more substantive, harder to achieve direct work. And I think probably most of us can point to examples where it certainly looks like that's the case. But I think as we participate, as the narrative about this, as the conversations about this, as the policy and the standards evolve, I think we need a more sort of sophisticated frame for that. And so what I think you have seen historically is that as companies look way outside their value chain towards offsets that have nothing to do in terms of their shape and form and look and feel to what their particular emissions portfolio looks like, that's a reasonably valid criticism and concern. But to apply that same sense that simply because you're looking for credits or you're looking to make reductions or make progress through these tools, you're doing it in lieu of doing real work, I think is problematic and isn't really going to be supported going forward. Many of these tools are designed to help and facilitate investments within a company's value chain. So even if my investment in, say, a renewable diesel facility is going to produce fuel that my particular vehicles don't have access to, I have a very big on-road transport emissions portfolio. So I'm at least placing my investments in ways that I'm trying to transform the market that I'm most affecting. And I think that changes some of that critique and that idea that these kinds of activities by definition mean companies are pursuing, lower value, least cost types of routes forward. It's a critique that we've learned, and I think has a lot of validity based on where we've been. It's one that I think we need to adapt to a much more sophisticated credit market going forward.
Yeah, JP?
Yeah, I'd like to react to that, Chris, and offer a different view, right? I absolutely see no problem with a company deciding to mitigate its climate change footprint by reducing greenhouse gases through activities that are done outside of the supply chain in a different country, in a sector with which they have absolutely no relationship otherwise, right? The ability to reduce greenhouse gas in the Kyoto Protocol, it is in the Paris Treaty, and it is in the most recent documents. CORSIA, recognizes it, in the CORSIA context. I think it is shameful for some of the groups that are out there to argue that somehow, a company based in the US should either, not be allowed to, make a claim of offsetting unless, for example, they've taken an SBTI target. I think that's completely absurd. Or two, that they should not make a claim of offsetting unless they've certain, internal abatement of, scope 1 reduction targets, right? I know there's a pushback, right? I'm not saying it does not exist. I think that the pushback is not justified. And and I'm not saying this way, I'm just offering a counterpoint. The risk that I see with those types of arguments is that ultimately, if the only companies that are taking actions in this world are the Amazon and the Microsoft of the world, where the carbon, to EBITDA ratio is very small, right? We're not going to change the world, and we're not going to get to net zero. In order to get to net zero, we need the energy sector to be full participants in the market. That means SBI needs to put on its pants and, adopt guidelines that allow the energy sector to participate in this process, which they have not done so, right? And then we need to get away from this idea that, we're putting all of these obstacles for people to take action, including, and most importantly, when these actions involve disadvantaged communities in poorer countries that require additional capital to transition, right? So I absolutely know where you're coming from, but I personally have not yet completely accepted these arguments. I do not believe they are fully valid, although I recognize where they're coming from.
Cynthia, I have a sense that.
I just need to respond, sorry.
Go ahead.
I gotta give the SBTI perspective. The reason why, and GC protocol, but specifically, why SBTI would not allow you to buy carbon credits to meet a science-based target is because the whole economy has to decarbonize. If a company does not take account for their own emissions and decarbonizing their own emissions in their value chain, nobody is going to. And those emissions have to decarbonize. And we'll get a lot of lock-in because a lot of those investments or a lot of the capital in those value chains are things that last for a long time. So if companies don't do that as soon as possible, take immediate action, then we're going to lock in all these emissions for a long time. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be investing in carbon credits and they shouldn't be helping emerging economies to decarbonize as well. It's not an either or thing. Both things need to happen, but companies' primary responsibility really needs to be decarbonizing their own value chain, because if they don't, nobody else is going to do it.
And I also want to come in by saying, I think it's also important to bear in mind that one carbon credit is not equal to one carbon credit to one carbon credit. So there's tons of standards. And the problem is that there's no environmental integrity in the carbon credits. And media is clearly doing their homework and getting the headlines, but as long as there is no integrity of the carbon credits, carbon markets are not going to work, because if corporates are taking a shortcut and buying cheaper credits, which are issued according to a certain standard, which may not be the perfect standard, or are taking shortcuts, then there's no way even those of us who truly believe in carbon markets are going to be able to keep pushing for it. So I really think that we go back to the way Cynthia started. I think we need a robust, transparent, liquid market with quality credits, and then we can have the conversation on how we can use it.
Yeah, absolutely. The quality bar is incredibly important to ensure that when you are talking about a ton, a credit that represents a ton of carbon, it actually represents a ton of carbon impact to the environment, is worth more than the paper and represents more than the paper it's written on. But assuming that we could get there, which will take a lot of work, there is value to the planet for a company to both walk and chew gum at the same time, decarbonize, and also potentially invest in value, in carbon reductions in carbon outside of their value chain. We'll turn back to the inside the value chain in just a second, but I guess I'll pose the question, and Cynthia, you actually got at this in your comment about the shift to beyond value chain, whatever that language was. One thing that I'm seeing as you're looking across actions by SBTI and the voluntary standard setters in this space, but also the regulators. I mentioned France passed a regulation that making it very difficult to make carbon neutral claims. There's state of California just required a fair amount, passed legislation requiring deep transparency on what a carbon credit that companies use. Is there a concern? I'd like you to reflect on the potential concern that if you're taking away all of the incentives for or uses for these carbon credits, which right now the use is a claim, like the carbon neutral claim on this glass, on this bottle, how are we going to get to a point where we have a functioning carbon market that is actually has the finance in it that is sufficient to support the impact of the planet that we need to see?
Yeah, I think that, as I was talking about before, I think if companies don't have a valuable claim that they can make with that include these investments in carbon credits, they're not going to make them. And so the voluntary system, unfortunately, is now disincentivizing them. I know SBTI is revisiting their all the requirements around target validation, and they are considering whether some portion of scope 3 emissions could be met with emission reductions to meet a target, could be met with some type of carbon credits. I know that's something they're considering because they understand how they are hindering the market and want to find a solution. But there are just such a big host of problems with the existing set of claims, climate neutral claims, that I think it is a good move forward to move away from those to some other system. And the VCMI, also the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative, is providing one alternative option. I just don't think it's that appealing yet. They're basically beyond value chain mitigation claims and with some tiers like platinum, gold, silver, standard, claims you can make based on the percentage of unabated emissions that you're compensating for with your carbon credits. I just don't think that has yet become an appealing claim for companies.
And I'm gonna take a second to unpack the beyond value chain, within value chain, because it's took a while for me to understand that or to think about it. The suite of much of what we've been talking about is carbon credits that are generated by projects that are not within a company's business. So they're, perhaps the least exciting and potentially problematic one is planting trees in some location. And that is not part of the company's business. You pay for that, you get a credit. But I want to, and there is deep and passionate criticism and concern about the credibility of some of these credits, which I think is like, I'd love your thoughts on how those debates and those discussions may be impacting the efforts that companies are going to have to take within their value chains. We talked to Chris and others talked about actions within scope 3, and those are the supply chains, either upstream or downstream of a company that they don't have direct control over, and but want to figure out how to focusing on the rubric which I agree with, which is decarbonize first and figure out how to offset only those emissions that you can't decarbonize. But even with the focusing on that decarbonization first, you need to figure out how to create market-based mechanisms and accounting that is credible to drive decarbonization within the supply chain, whether it's the maritime fuels or the energy use of the devices that you sell, and figuring out how to do that. There's a tension on, like, a little bit of a pox on all your houses because of concerns about the credibility of the outside beyond value chain carbon market that I think I'd love your thoughts on that question, and then also whether there are lessons that can be learned from the decades of work that you all have been doing in the carbon markets that can be brought to that value chain decarbonization work.
I think just to start with just one example that was saying, like, I think in terms of these scope 3 market mechanisms, which are moving fast, they're really, this concept is really burgeoning over the last couple of years. The first sector that I think really tried to tackle this is the agriculture sector, because like for the food processing companies, the biggest emission source is the on-farm emissions from growing like the raw materials that are inputs to their products, and they're buying commodities, so they don't know where they're getting their product from in many cases. So they're like, they have this perplexing problem. How do they need a scope 3 reduction target when they don't even know who they're buying the product from? How can they influence those emissions? So there has been different like working groups that have come together to think through, like, well, if let's say you have cocoa in your supply chain, I might know what country I'm buying it from, but I don't know the farm. Like, what if I want to make an investment on that farm, maybe do it collectively with a group of companies that are all buying cocoa? How can I make that investment on farm to reduce emissions and then claim that towards my target? And I think there's a lot of discussion about how that should be done, and there's some sample like accounting methods out there for that, and there's some guidance. And now the AIM platform that I mentioned earlier is trying to tackle like how to standardize that accounting and then validate those emission reductions. And what Chris was talking about with all these sort of SAF and maritime fuel, those book and claim methods is another scope 3 market mechanism, type of scope 3 market mechanism that is evolving and growing, and that AIM platform is also trying to tackle. So I think hopefully that is one of the places that is gonna standardize these approaches, but as Chris was mentioning too, like these standards are like just filling a gap that policy has not filled. And they, as he's mentioned, like it's the outside influence of these NGO efforts is much larger than was anticipated when the efforts were created, and regulation, eventually I think like regulation is gonna have to, government is gonna have to step in and regulate these markets.
You succeeded beyond your dreams, Cynthia.
Yeah, exactly. It's true.
Does anyone jump? Okay, Chris, you can jump in, and I'm just giving a warning that the floor is going to be the audience's for questions for the last 10 minutes. So warm up your question bank.
I'm happy to defer to the floor if you prefer. I was going to build on Cynthia's example, but I'm happy to give to the floor and give time.
So, Cynthia, you've mentioned this the potential need for regulation to step in where so my question is, are there too many standard setting organizations? So I guess part of the overall issue is credibility, and there is there's no public acceptance of this, even though there are some decent standards, and there's some, there's a system for certifying. Some of them are part of long-standing certification systems, some of them are not, but is there just too much of this going on for any person in the public to understand?
And I'm going to repeat the question for the audience on Zoom and repack it maybe just a little bit. The question is that there are a lot of voluntary standards and voluntary initiatives. Is there a flavor of the question is there too many, but also is there a rule for regulation, and what would be some appropriate or opportunities for government regulation in this space that would be productive? And I'll open the floor to everyone, because I know Chris and others have spent a lot of time thinking about that, but I'll start with Chris because we interrupted his take questions from the floor. So,
well, I have far less interesting to say here. I think really. I mean, I think the answer of that, in some level, is yes. I mean, this is a carbon. What's weird about the carbon markets as a commodities market is how many ancillary bodies there are in the ecosystem. You have methodology developers, you have verifiers, you have project developers, you have buyers. The layers are crazy, and those have all evolved for legitimate reasons to fill legitimate gaps of information and problems within the market. But they've left us, as the person who asked the question, I think they've left us with an ecosystem of acronyms that only somebody who works at a company as big as Amazon or someplace else can afford to pay somebody to track. Or maybe that's how, JB, how you're able to stay on top of these. But I think that's I don't know what the solution to that is right now, right? And there's going to be a rationalization happening, I think, through some of the VCMI, CVCM entities and guidance that Cynthia referenced, and hopefully through the consulting processes that are underway right now. I don't think the layers are something that anyone wants. But you have a world where there's a lot of guidance competing with a lot of guidance, and at some point there needs to be a sort of distilling to the top for that, and I'm not sure the mechanism through which that happens.
Our view, our hope is that at some point the voluntary market will become a compliance market. So whether that's going to be the standards that are going to be created under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and it's going to be UN driven. It's not ideal. Some of us were already working in carbon markets back in the day with the CDM, and that was pretty strenuous, to say it mildly. So, but at some point, these voluntary standards will become compliance standards for sure.
I agree. Yeah, I think this, again, all these voluntary standards were just intended to fill a gap that policy wasn't filling. Eventually policy's got to take over, because Yeah, as Chris is saying, it's impossible for any company to track all these initiatives and stay up to date on what's happening and understand how they all work together. The NGOs all communicate really well with each other and they're pretty coordinated. It's a coordinated ecosystem, but it's not, I don't see it as sustainable in the long term.
JP, any thoughts?
No, I could not agree more. I think it will be interesting to see how Article 6 will work out for developing countries, because when you think about it, even if you have a questionable project in a country, from an additionality perspective, for example, but that, reduction or that carbon credit gets a CA, a corresponding adjustment, it becomes essentially a unit of trade under the Paris Agreement. And then it does not really matter whether it exists or not, because there is a corresponding adjustment in a national inventory. So I think in developing countries, I think we're going to see that happening. And I think an interesting question will be, will the market perception of the quality of that credit go up because of that? Or will there be an assessment done country by country and project by project? I think that's an interesting question. Other interesting question is what happens with companies like in the US, right? Where there's never been a process to give a letter of approval, right? Which is required under, what's required under Kyoto, which would be required under Paris. And you do have developers in the US who are doing, for example, removal projects at a very, very high marginal cost, right? But they cannot get the ton out of the US because the State Department doesn't have regulations to issue a Paris Treaty letter of approval, right? So I think to me, I agree with everything you've said. I think the Article 6 will, in some fashion, be an interesting case study on how the voluntary market becomes the compliance market.
Okay, speed round. We have 2 questions, one in front, one in the back.
So I was going to ask what was learned from the Zimbabwe failure. Maybe I want to ask that question. However we get to whether it's a compliance model, regulatory model, there still needs to be a trusted verification mechanism. So do you think that trusted verification mechanism is continue to go down the current path, enhancing it, or a different model of verification?
Should we continue to go down the current path of the verification model, or start fresh, or something new?
I can start and then you guys jump in. Go ahead. Verification has become much more sophisticated than it was back in the Kyoto days, just a few years ago. It's really becoming very, very digital. So I'm not sure, I don't have a strong opinion whether it should be project-based or sector-based or how exactly it should look. But I can tell you that there's a bunch of companies, and you guys know more about it than I do, that are measuring with drones. So it's becoming a much lighter touch than having physically verifiers going and measuring, looking in an energy company, looking at the thing to see how many emissions were reduced. It's become much more hands-off, thanks to COVID in a way. And also because there's been a lot of innovation.
Hi, I'm Megan Chaplin, Vice President for Sustainability here at Georgetown. And you may not realize that there's a whole industry of higher ed institutions that are trying to do the same thing. And we're all struggling with, how do we address scope 3? We have conversations internally. So I just want to flag that. And the corporate sector does tend to break the ice for us in many ways. And so I'm hearing that there's sort of and perhaps an incentive for corporates for sustainability teams within this corporate sector to work with their government relations teams to lobby for a better standard, for example, within the United States. So is the pain bad enough yet that you all are talking with your GR teams about, oh, let's go to the Hill and lobby or talk to our representatives or whoever we work with around finding a better standard?
Better standard for what though?
for verifying and you know, for legitimizing offsets and being able to measure them in ways that are uniform. So you're talking about doing it with through the UN, and so can national, because in the US it's happening at the state levels, but can it happen at the state level and at the national level that's aligned with where it's gonna go in the UN? Is there pain?
Yeah. When there is a UN standard and it's not the case yet, then it will trickle down to national level and it will need to trickle down to state level.
I mean, the United States really voluntarily. I feel like corporations are gonna have to.
Yeah.
It's coming, so coming from the top down, coming from local California, it's a patchwork of regulations. And to your question about whether there are successful conversations going to the public policy team and saying, go to Congress and ask for more regulation. That's sometimes a tough conversation to have. But it's important, and one of, we're gonna end on time, one of the goals of this discussion was really to inform what ELI should be thinking about and areas for work in this space, and continued partnership with academic institutions, both on the implementation, but also on the thought leadership on this. So thank you for that. And I will point out, it's not just higher ed. My daughter's elementary, middle school and high school have a net zero goal as well, and are trying to figure out how to do that. So thank you all. And there's a short break, and the afternoon plenary sessions pick up at 4:30 at the Gerwich Student Center, which was where the morning was, across the walkway, and look forward to seeing you there. And then the reception that starts at 5:30. Thank you, JP and Chris.
It'll give you. I know. I heard them because I know. I had to travel.
Oh, that's true. Okay. Thank you. I should have taken a video of your picture.
Oh, gosh. I have a hard time hiding. Yeah.